Confession time. I've been putting off this video for quite a while. If you're new to the channel, it's been over a year since I began my examination of Tituba. In my first attempt, I followed an admittedly roughshod pathway through what little we know about her life prior to the Salem Witch Trials. I stumbled through what I then perceived to be the facts, trying my best to make sense of the conflicting reports we have about the woman. But if I'm honest, my hesitation to return to Tituba has almost nothing to do with whatever contradictions I've come across in my time reading and thinking about the Salem Witch Trials and her activity during them. In truth, the reason this has been such a hard script for me to write is the same reason that Tituba remains one of, if not the, most discussed, researched, considered figures in the trials. Namely, that reason is, I don't think we've gotten her story quite right yet. Not entirely. A cursory glance at the first few pages of Google's search engine return pages for the term Tituba returns no small number of articles claiming to have the quote true story on this still mysterious figure. And I too have been lured into this speculative web. I have written and rewritten this script because of my own gravitation toward this or that theory. I've come down on one side of history only to be upended by another. So what I'd like to do in this video is just do away with making a decision at all. Tituba was complicated, so I'm going to let her be complicated by not claiming to have any authoritative picture of who she was and why she did what she did or didn't do what she didn't do. Instead, I'm going to build a scaffolding out of what history we are relatively sure about, present what I find to be the most compelling arguments for why Tituba did or didn't take certain actions, and then leave it up to you to decide. Because if there's one certainty about Tituba, it's that much like during her own lifetime, her actions come across much differently depending on who or what you believe they served. Was she looking out for her family's interests or her master's? Was she possessed by a liberating spirit and therefore fueling the fires of hysteria to expedite her exit from Salem or perhaps from slavery itself? Was she caught up in the machinations of a much more powerful and cruel Puritan machine, the gears of which stretched all the way across the Atlantic Ocean? There's compelling evidence for each of these claims and more, and today we're going to have a look at much of that evidence, and as well as many of those claims. Because the more I've sat with it, the more I've come to believe that Tituba's story just might be the last crucial missing piece toward a comprehensive understanding of the Salem Witch Trials. Her motivations reframe how we might understand the entire affair. She was that central to the horrors that befell that burgeoning seaport. So now, with the appropriate gravity applied, let's jump in slightly before we left off in part 1, Tituba's arrival to the New World. While Tituba was most certainly enslaved before being forced to leave her Caribbean home, it's important to note here that the transition to American enslavement would have been an immensely harsh one. For starters, there was the weather. Tituba arrived with Samuel Parris in late 1680. For the last 3 months of 2019, the weather around the area that Tituba came from in the Caribbean averaged in the mid-80-degree Fahrenheit range at the high end. In Boston, that same range was in the 50s, and those are at the high ends. At night, Tituba would have been subjected to the infamous Boston winter, with temperatures plunging into the low teens as cold, moist, icy wind blew in off the coast of the Atlantic. The likelihood that Tituba had experienced weather anywhere remotely like that before this period in her life is pretty slim. But the weather wasn't the only immediate resistance Tituba faced upon her arrival to the New World. As covered in the last video, Tituba was perceived by the residents of Salem as an American Indian, as was her husband, John. Now this is crucially important to the rest of the story because at the time of their arrival with Samuel Parris, their owner, the entire Massachusetts Bay Colony and much of the rest of the New World was embroiled in a bitter war with the Native American inhabitants of the land. For some 6 decades prior to Tituba's arrival, a concerted military effort on the part of the settlers in present-day Massachusetts and Connecticut had been underway. This military union was undergone to battle a unified front of Native American tribes who were increasingly organized and effective. The tension between the native peoples and European settlers frequently erupted in open conflict, late-night raids, entire families being slaughtered or forced into slavery, and many more unspeakable horrors. This all culminated in what is still considered the bloodiest war per capita in United States history, a 14-month-long conflict known as King Philip's War. Throughout 1675, the leader of the Native Alliance, known as King Philip or Metacom, leader of the Wampanoag tribe, led the alliance to several effective and decisive victories. On both sides of the conflict, there were heavy losses, but King Philip had a particular knack for holding his alliance together, finding the weak points in the emergent colonies in Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maine, and Rhode Island, and surgically attacking the colonists where it would hurt them the most. 1676, however, saw the alliance unravel, but not because of anything King Philip did or didn't do. The leader of one of the most crucial tribes to the effort, the Narragansett, was assassinated in April of that year. In May, the colonists' militia followed up that slaying by attacking the tribe and killing nearly 200 of its members. By that summer, the balance of the conflict had shifted. The colonists sided with other tribes, offering them peace. This and the rapid disintegration of one of the tribes most central to King Philip's War meant that by late summer, the natives were suddenly the ones on the run. Then, in August, an Indian English soldier shot and killed King Philip. His body was mutilated, his head placed on a spike outside the gates of the Plymouth colony for 2 decades. The following 2 years saw no end to this violence, only its formalized aspect. Nighttime raids were still commonplace, as was the interruption of cargo movement, often ending in multiple deaths on both sides and vital supplies for either camp being annihilated. It wasn't until 1678 that a formal peace treaty was signed between the colonists and the natives. Tituba got off the boat a mere 2 years later in the heart of the New World. Now you can imagine what she must have felt. The tension must have been absolutely insane. While her skin color certainly didn't help Tituba's odds of making it through her New England enslavement alive, it's worth noting here that racial tensions were just one of the many, many tensions at play at the time of her arrival. It would only be a few short years after she stepped foot in Boston that, due to a whole lot of political and economic one-upsmanship, the Massachusetts Bay Colony lost its charter with the Crown. Now, this essentially meant that the governing rules laid out by the Crown no longer applied, and until the Crown and the colony could come to an agreement about the nature of their relationship, the Massachusetts Bay's future was severely compromised. Around the time of the charter's revoking, the Crown was also dealing with 2 wars and the Great Plague and Great Fire of London. This meant that it took a full 2 years for the Crown to deliver its plans to the colonists, which amounted to a merger with Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island into a large royal colony. Now, as far as the Massachusetts colonists were concerned, this was very much not going to fly, as they had been, since their own charter was issued in 1629, a charter colony rather than a royal one. This distinction is important because in a charter colony, the administration of the colony is undertaken by elected officials within its ranks. Essentially, this amounted to self-governance with restrictions. Charter colonies also had to share some of their resources with the Crown, so being turned into basically an auxiliary of the Crown in this merger very much did not sit well with the colonists in and around Boston. This wouldn't be officially resolved until a year before the Salem Witch Trials erupted, but we'll get back to that period of time in just a moment. Around 1688, Samuel Parris took Tituba and his and her family to Salem. And here, too, Tituba was likely stepping into a wholly different place than the one she'd known in Boston or in the Caribbean before that. Salem was, and I don't even really know a way to say this without it sounding like an absurd understatement, Salem was messed up. Bad. Now, I won't go into too much of how exactly it got this messed up, since it ultimately doesn't have a lot to do with Tituba, but when I get to the Putnams, boy, are you in for a treat. For now, let's just say by the time Tituba arrived, Salem had literally split itself in 2. The rural agrarian residents outside the city center had decided to make a go of it themselves and were in the process of doing everything they could to distance themselves from the comparatively metropolitan residents of the urban center. This new place was called Salem Village, the city center, Salem town. Now, part of the reason this split was wanted by the residents of Salem Village was that they thought themselves quite different from their kin in the city. There were economic and political reasons too, of course, but that doesn't have much to do with Tituba either. What did concern her was the decidedly fanatical bent of puritanical Christianity that was well entrenched by the time she arrived. Now, this accounted for part of the division between Salem Village and Salem Town, so as part of their ongoing efforts to both distance themselves from and royally piss off their urban kin, who they viewed as sinful, greedy, and opportunistic, the villagers decided to set up their own church. After a few ministers didn't quite work out for them, Samuel Parris became the minister of this still new congregation, which was, crucially, mostly filled with members of the Putnam family. I mention this because from here on out, you're going to hear a lot about how Samuel Parris was trying to seize and hold power. That involves his relationship with the Putnam, so it's important to know up front that the Putnam-Parris relationship is really the backbone of pretty much everything that's about to come. You know, the Salem Witch Trials was a really complicated time in history, but if you are looking for clear villains, you could do a lot worse than the Putnams and Samuel Parris. I'm honestly looking forward to the day that I can put on a red cape, crank up the motorhead, and write the script on Samuel Parris, but unfortunately, that day is not today. So what you need to know here is that upon his arrival, Samuel Parris was woefully unqualified for the job. His first years there saw him arguing with his new flock over his salary, something his forebears in the church had done as well. What was clear, I'm sure, to Parris and Tituba is that every single aspect of life in Salem Village was, in one way or another, connected to the church, and most of the members of the church could not stand each other. So these first few years in Salem saw Tituba engaged with cleaning and cooking. It's not known exactly when Tituba married John Indian, and now we've arrived at the first theory with which you're going to have to do whatever you see fit. There are some historians who argue that both Tituba and Samuel Parris's marriage, which had occurred shortly after he arrived in Boston, were done to obfuscate from the same truth. And that is that Tituba and Samuel Parris had been involved in some form of sexual relationship. There's even some evidence that Tituba might have had a child. You see, both Tituba and her husband entered back into public life shortly after the trials concluded. We'll get to that, or at least Tituba's side of that, later in this episode. But in 1720, Samuel Parris left 30 pounds to a mysterious Indian woman named Violet. Now, based on that 30 pounds and the then market rate for slaves, some historians have estimated that at that time, Violet would have been around in her 30s, placing her birth in the 1690s. Some even speculate that this is ultimately the explanation for Tituba's behavior during the entire affair. Whether or not this particular speculation is true, what is above doubt is the pressure that the new reverend was under right from the beginning of his time in Salem. He argued with the leaders of his congregation over firewood, his salary, and the manner of the religious community in Salem. His sermons quickly took on a confrontational, hellfire and brimstone kind of tone, and in these sermons, Parris preached about Salem being under siege. He painted the atmosphere as one of constant stress and crisis. He claimed that evil had infiltrated the village and even connected a few of his new opponents, who were basically those people the most responsible for his perceived early slights in the community, as connected to Satan. It is absolutely certain that Tituba, her husband, and the children who were in the Parris home and who would go on to begin the hysteria heard these sermons. But it wasn't just Satan, the loss of the charter, and clashes with the Native American population that was contributing to the stress that Parris was preaching about. A drought in 1691 severely limited the food stores in Salem for the following year, and the winter of 1692 is infamously one of the worst on record. So by the time the events that would lead to the trials began, you can hardly imagine the sheer volume of pressure that was on every single person surrounding Tituba. No doubt every moment was electric, every morning made anxious by the constant and mounting threats encroaching on all sides. It's here that we arrive at another contentious issue in the story of Tituba that involves the use of ritualistic magic. Now, if you've seen The Crucible, Salem, or any number of other fictional representations of the events of the witch trials, the image of Tituba as a voodoo-wielding sorceress is likely pretty deep in your imagination. Unfortunately, as cool as it would be for this to be true, the real story is likely much less interesting. Yes, Tituba likely knew some rudimentary forms of ritual and practices that we might identify as magical or witchcraft, but she was not distinct in this way. Everyone in Salem knew such practices and employed them on a regular basis as remedies, wards, blessings, etc. So the idea that Tituba ever danced naked in the woods with the girls leading up to the fits taking hold is an absolute fiction. These reputations actually began in the 19th and 20th centuries, hundreds of years after Tituba's death and the conclusion of the trials. Likewise, the sort of picture of Satan that would be painted later in the trials wasn't really present in Tituba's earliest confessions. While there were some of the images of Satan that other Salem residents would claim to also have participated with in Tituba's confessions, there was a whole lot of other mythological, fantastical stuff that didn't come back up after Tituba left the stand. So Tituba's early confessions were far less sinister in nature than later confessions, and even her later confessions, which we'll get to in a minute. The turning point for Tituba's representation, and indeed the nature of the fits of the afflicted girls, seems to have been around the time of the infamous witch cake incident. Basically, at this point in the lead up to the trials, Betty Parris, that's Samuel Parris's daughter, had been displaying mild symptoms of witchcraft for some time, but they were becoming more severe and spreading out to other girls around the community. So an Old English test for witchcraft was conducted, whereby Betty's urine was baked into a cake, and then the cake was given to a dog. So this came to pass, and Tituba was instrumental in making the witch cake incident happen. So it's around this time in the record that Tituba begins to be referred to as a magician, conjurer, sorceress, and in league with the devil by other people around what will become the Salem Witch Trials. The girls suffering the fits start to begin to lump Tituba in with a cadre of other suspected witches, and their episodes become increasingly strange and violent, the fits of the girls. So these events all start unfolding during the earliest months of 1692. The first arrest warrants went out on the last day of February, and Tituba was among them, along with Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. Now, what these three women shared was that neither had a particularly influential role in Salem's public affairs, and each was disliked for various reasons. For Tituba, it's pretty easy to see why she was targeted. She looked like the enemy, had spent tons of time around Betty Parris and the other children in and around the Parris household, like Abigail Williams for one, and the likelihood that some form of magical practice took place during that time is pretty high, but again, this wouldn't have distinguished Tituba on its own from any other woman of childbearing age in Salem. The witch cake, for instance, was actually Mary Sibley's recipe, European white woman, but put alongside the increasingly fantastical accounts of the girls, Tituba's skin color and her uninfluential standing in the community, it does make total sense why she would have been seen as easy prey for the fanatical drivers of the accusations and ultimately the trials. So following her arrest and imprisonment, we don't hear from Tituba again until March 5th, when she makes her now infamous confession. The question of Samuel Parris's motivations in the days leading up to and directly after Tituba's arrest are crucial in order to begin to understand why Tituba made the stunning confession that she did. Now, the first thing to know is that Parris was not a stranger to witch trials. He, along with a bunch of other Salemites at the time, were intimately familiar with a famous trial conducted in Boston involving the Goodwin children in 1688. This trial, which saw the hanging of one Anne Glover, was in many ways the blueprint for what would come to pass in Salem. Anne was of lower caste, she was Irish, she was vehemently loathed by members of her community. Local religious and scientific thought leaders, the Mather family, Cotton and Increase, were very involved in that case and would go on to be involved in the Salem Witch Trials as well. The case was an absolute sensation at the time, and Definitely something I'll cover more in depth as we examine other players in the Salem Witch Trials. For now, though, know that the sequence of events that played out in Anne Glover's march toward the gallows are very similar to the ones that played out in Salem, and that Samuel Parris most definitely knew how Anne's entire case went down is crucial to understand where his head was at in the lead up to Tituba's confession. Now, Samuel Parris wouldn't have been too thrilled about this whole witch cake thing. While many folk remedies that we might view as witchcraft now weren't necessarily seen that way in 1692, a witch cake would have been seen by Parris as venturing a little too close to the devil for comfort. Now, I'm not entirely convinced if he would have actually believed that, or if he would have just said that he believed it in order to preserve what little reputation he had in Salem Village at the time. I suppose it doesn't really matter. Regardless, when Parris found out about the witch cake incident, he beat the hell out of Tituba to torture her involvement in the affair out of her. So it's in these days, the ones where he's beating her, the post-witch cake and pre-arrest days, that I think that if there is some conspiratorial angle on why the witch trials began between Parris and Tituba, I believe it's here that such a scheme could have theoretically been hatched. Tituba became the focal point of Parris's wrath during this time, and he's been noted by historians of having seemed to be bent on proving Tituba's guilt. Now, there's a few ways you can interpret that, I suppose, considering what we've seen of Tituba and Parris's relationship, what that might have looked like behind closed doors. Regardless of which interpretation you rest on, what's clear is that Tituba's desire to confess was certainly solidified by the time she was arrested. It seems clear to me that Parris made it perfectly plain to her what would happen if she denied being a witch, knowledge which he would have had due to his awareness of the Boston trial in 1688, among others. So it's highly probable that by the time Tituba made her way into the first hearings, she knew exactly what was expected of her by her master. Tituba's confession is one of the most complicated affairs in the whole of the Salem Witch Trials, and if there is a single confession that is the most responsible for kicking off the horrors to come, this one is it. Over a week-long period, Tituba was questioned along with Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. Unlike the others, Tituba readily admitted to being in league with the devil. She spoke of dreams, strangers in the night, and encounters with obscured Puritans who were actually members of the devil's party. But it is in these descriptions of the Puritans that we find the ultimate brilliance of Tituba's confession, because the figures she claims to have come in contact with, both spectrally and physically, were dressed well. They were large, powerful Puritans, leaders of their community. Tracking what she's doing here, a form of rebellion begins to emerge in Tituba's confession, because yes, on the one hand, she gave Parris exactly what he asked for, but she also went much, much further. Not only were the lowly thorns in the side of the Salem Village elite implicated, the seeds were sown here for more prominent members to become accused later as well. Now, this would ultimately be what caused the trials to end, someone above the power hierarchy in Salem Village being implicated, but it would be months before that would happen. It's in this seeding, in my opinion, that the most honest representation of Tituba as having taken some ethical stand against what was happening to her can be found. It was so clever, in fact, that its potential dangers were totally missed by the ones clamoring for the trials to advance into hangings, which they would shortly do with the death of Bridget Bishop only a month or so later. But not all historians agree with this interpretation of Tituba's confession. Some claim that the confession actually reveals someone clearly making things up on the spot for no other reason than to get out of being questioned. They claim that Tituba clearly simply wanted to escape. So I'm going to leave the interpretation up to you. You can find the full record of Tituba's day one confession in the description. It's not very long, so go give it a read and decide for yourself. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. So day one of her testimony ends with the girls in a hysterical fit. For the following week, Tituba expanded on her relationship with the devil in subsequent hearings. She would have been carted back and forth 10 miles each way to the prison in Ipswich where she was being held and the village meeting house where the hearings were happening. She claimed to have been in the devil's service for years. She described shadowy meetings with others in the devil's service that took place in Boston. Later, people in their confessions would make claims that such meetings had taken place in and around Salem Village. She was stripped and searched for a witch's mark, which was common amongst anyone who was accused of witchcraft. What's perhaps most notable about the nature of her later confessions in this week is just how fantastical they become. She contradicted herself, merged culturally disparate representations of witchcraft and the devil, and spun wild yarns, the likes of which remained distinct to Tituba as the trials progressed. Because she was Native American, her confession was actually viewed by upstanding community members like Reverend Hale as metaphorically rich and honest and peppered with the language of symbolism of her people. After all, how could someone such as her with such a feeble cognitive apparatus recall events with such rich detail if they were not telling the truth? This is what the Salem elites who viewed Tituba's confession and wanted things to progress into the trials believed about that confession. And this perception of Tituba's confession won out in the meeting house, and by the time she was moved to a Boston prison on March 7th, 1692, Tituba had escalated the trials into an absolute fervor. Now, there's obviously much more to say about the trials past this point, because this is really where they get started, but that's actually a story for another video in this series, because it's here that Tituba's direct involvement with the Salem Witch Trials concludes. She was relocated to the Salem jail in June, and there she remained imprisoned until the summer of 1693, well after the trials concluded. That makes her entire time in captivity a year and a few months. She remained in prison so long after the conclusion of the trials because she couldn't pay her own prison fines. Yes, you heard that correctly. If you were imprisoned during the time of the Salem Witch Trials, you had to pay for your own expenses while incarcerated, and if you couldn't leave. Now, it would have obviously been up to Samuel Parris as her owner to pay those fines for her, but he refused, likely hoping that she would, as many did, die in captivity. So ownership of Tituba would pass on to whomever could pay the fines for her release, and there was a very short list of people in and around Salem who would have been willing and able to do such a thing. So it's important to note here that one of the few records of Tituba's intentions came from this era of her imprisonment. During this time, Tituba reportedly claimed that her master had beaten her, abused her, and forced her to confess and accuse others in the community, and that he had done all of this for the sole purpose of using her confession against other members of the Salem community. So if you're looking for a clear representation of Tituba's intentions as spoken by the woman herself, this is the only place outside of the trials and the events directly connected to the trials that you're going to find it. But it is secondhand through a historian, so take it with a little bit of a grain of salt. These last records of Tituba's time in prison are some of the last we have of her historical record, period. Many historians believe that Tituba remained in the area for some years after her release from prison, but what exactly she did in that time and who paid the fines for her release are both still unknown to this day, although there is no shortage of speculation and fiction based on the later parts of Tituba's life. Some of it involves Samuel Parris, some of it her husband, John Indian, who also vanished after the trials. After all the reading and research I've done on Tituba, I'm still not sure exactly which side of the question I land on. Where I've kind of arrived is that the truth is that it's likely a bit of both, that Tituba was a reluctant pawn and a tactical genius. It's certainly true that Tituba's confession was coerced by Samuel Parris. I see absolutely no reason to doubt that, and 50 good reasons that support it. And it's also true that that confession had Parris's desired result. It escalated the trials. After that, it seems Parris's want of Tituba entirely vanished. Now, this might have been because Parris wanted to keep something that Tituba knew hidden, or it could simply be that Tituba had been stained by the mark of the devil. Again, I think it's a little bit of both. What makes sense to me is that Tituba was caught up in something larger than she anticipated. She was coerced into participating in it, but then in the act of participating, she realized what power she had to change the outcome of the hearings and ultimately the trials. Now, I'm not sure if Tituba necessarily wanted people dead, but I also wouldn't blame her one bit if she did. I mean, think about how emotionally traumatizing the events she had lived through up to the beginning of the trials must have been for her, and think about who the people were that dropped those horrors in her life. What did they all seem to look like, talk like, say about and to her? What did they believe about the nature of the universe, God, the devil? What did they seem to view her as? Where did they value her humanity positioned against their own? Viewed through this lens of someone who was ripped out of their homeworld, forced into a land that was brutal, surrounded by people who loathed her, it's easy to see why Tituba might have leaned in so hard during her confession. She, like the teenage accusers and her husband, were very much not used to being heard by the Puritan elite around them, and suddenly there's entire rooms of these people hanging on her every word. Suddenly they're returning day after day to hear her fantastical accounts of devils and bewitchments. To me, this explanation makes the most sense, and it clearly worked. Tituba is one of the few key players in the trials who didn't see their full horrors. She's one of the few of the early accused who escaped with their life, and based on what little evidence exists of her life post-imprisonment, she seems to be one of the few who made it through the Salem Witch Trials and went on to have some semblance of a life afterwards. It's for these reasons and more that Tituba continues to capture the imagination of historians, artists, and lovers of Salem to this very day. So what do you think about the life of Tituba? Why do you think she gave the confession she did? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, share this witchy goodness all around to make sure I get the love I need to keep this train going. Stay weird, witches. I'll see you next time.